I have a Minolta W.Rokkor X 28mm f2.8 lens here that I'm going to be fully disassembling. Comparing this to the MC W.Rokkor, which is a 3.5 that I have here, this lens is much smaller and about probably 3/4 of the weight as well when you compare the two side by side. And it's actually a lot easier to take this MD Rokkor apart. It's not as repairable in that a lot of the components are really integrated together, but this MC Rokkor over here, the 28mm, it's a lot more complex in its construction. So while you can repair it better, the MD Rokkor here, it's a whole lot easier to actually do simple repairs on. I'm going to be fully disassembling this lens and getting access to the diaphragm, mechanical components, and the body sections on their own as much as possible. Starting off, I'll get access to the front of the diaphragm going in from the front section here. On the name ring, there are two little divots for a spanning wrench over here and here. You can use a pointed tip spanning wrench on. And this is just a plastic name ring. This lens does use a lot more plastic components where the MC Rokkor doesn't. I think it's pretty much all metal on that MC Rokkor. Next up, I have the ring here, the black ring going around here that the filters in the name ring we're screwing into. It just has three little screws going around here that you can undo. And now I can actually undo the front optical piece here. We have access to the front optical piece. One thing I did find that is easier to do though is to take off the focusing ring before undoing this front optical piece. It's pretty far down inside the lens even with it focused all the way out. So it's a bit hard to actually grab onto this front optical piece. Here I've already loosened it up so I can do this, but for the first time I took this apart, I had to take off the focusing ring. So that's what I'll do now. And the focusing ring right here, once you take this off, you have to zero the lens back to infinity, but it was really the only way I could take off the front optical piece here. So the focusing ring is just held in place by three little screws here with little washers as well. So I'll remove these and lift off the focusing ring. We got the focusing ring here so it can be cleaned on its own, and it also has the two little stoppers that limit how far in and out you can focus on either extreme. So as you turn this back and forth, these two hit against the little post in here, which is actually limiting the focusing. And now to actually remove the front optical piece, you can see it's just attaching into the focusing mechanism down here. This top section in here is the front optical piece. And to remove it, I've already loosened up like I said, but to remove it the first time it was pretty well in there. So I actually had to use I guess it's called a flexible gripping wrench, and it's a pretty large piece that I have here. It's something you don't normally use on like a car or something, but it allows you to grab around these circular shaped items and actually tighten onto them and grab them. So this is kind of a ridiculous piece to use on a lens, but this is how I had to loosen it up the first time. So I went in with the flexible wrench and then loosened it up. Since there's no slots on here for a spanning wrench that I can see. So unfortunately I had to use this kind of crazy tool to undo this. So this now will just unscrew, and here we have the front optical piece of the lens, much smaller than on the MC Rokkor. And I also have access to the front of the diaphragm blades. So looking in at the diaphragm down here, you can clean off the front of the blades in this current state. Like on a lot of the MD lenses, the diaphragm and the intersection of the focusing mechanism are all one part, which is, it makes cleaning the diaphragm a little bit harder because you have to worry about getting oil from the coils here actually onto the diaphragm. And now I'll get access to the back of the diaphragm as well, and just looking at the back of the lens, I'm going to focus inwards a little bit so that the back glass here is sticking out. And I'll remove the back optics as well. The back optics have four little divots for spanning wrenches, but the inner ones here on this side undo the actual elements. So you want the outer ones on the outermost ring to actually undo just the back optical piece. So I'll undo this with the spanning wrench. And that just lifts right out. Again, like on the MC Rokkor, the back optical piece is much smaller on these wide angle lenses than the front optical piece. On the rest of the back of the lens here, there's the mounting plate going around on the bottom here, and then this black ring. And the black ring on the inside here both keeps elements out of the inside of the lens, and it also contains the mount itself. So this silver section and the black ring in here are all one piece. So I'll undo this. It's not necessary to actually take off this ring for most cases, but it does allow you to clean things on its own, or clean things on their own. And one thing that I did have a lot of trouble with on this lens when I first took it apart is that these screws are very tightly, at least on this copy, they were in there very tightly. So it was very easy to strip them. And I had to use quite a bit of force to actually undo these sections. So I'll undo this back plate by removing these 5 screws going around here, and just lift that off. Right, so you can see the integration between the actual mount for the bayonet mount here and that black plate that's keeping things out of the inside of the lens. And now I'll take off the mounting plate itself, which just has these 4 screws here that are keeping it in place. This mount just lifts off, and like on a lot of the MD lenses, this has a very similar design where it's got the stop-down lever and the aperture control coupling in a single piece that's just getting coupled through this crescent-shaped black piece in here. I'll explain a little more about that during the reassembly. And here on the lens body again, there's this copper ring that is kind of keeping things, I guess a large washer there that I'll remove. It goes with the mounting plate. And next up, I have the aperture control ring in here with the aperture control curve over on this side, and a little ball bearing over, I believe, in here that's making the clicking sound as this moves back and forth. So I'll remove this, just be careful with the ball bearing so don't lose that. And on this copy, the ball bearing rests on the inside of the lens right here. There's a little spring in a pocket right there, and there's the ball bearing. So I'll set that aside, and it's pressed up against grooves on the aperture control ring to make the clicking sound. And finally, for disassembling this lens, the one other thing I can do is remove the inner part of the focusing mechanism, so the innermost part with the diaphragm, from the main lens body. And this doesn't really allow you to clean the diaphragm any better, but I will just remove this for the sake of having a fuller disassembly here. The way this is held in place is that as I focus in and out by rotating this kind of bluish color metal ring, the little section in here, there's a track, and then this little post that's actually, or bar that's going along the track. So that's actually holding the intersection in place, so it moves up and down instead of just spinning around. So I want to undo the intersection. So to actually undo these 2 components, I'll remove the bar here from the track. So it just is held in place by these 2 screws. And now I can grab the inner part of the focusing mechanism, just the silver section up here, and I kind of want to remember where this was oriented, so I'm going to mark on the main lens body. There's on this bluish colored ring, there's a little gap right here, so I'm going to mark on the lens where that was, just with some pencil, and then grab the top section of the focusing mechanism, just focus this out a little more, just until it gets to the very edge of where it was. Okay, and I'll also mark on this piece over by this little gap where this was, so kind of in here as well. So now I can separate the inner part of the focusing mechanism, which is a little bit hard to grab here because it has all the oil and stuff, and the diaphragm, which is on the inside here, from the outer part of the focusing mechanism right here. On this diaphragm focusing mechanism piece, the way you can take this further apart and clean the aperture blades on their own, which I'm not going to actually demonstrate, but I'll explain how you do it, is on this front section here, the silver ring is holding the diaphragm blades in place. It's holding this black plate in place. So if you loosen up these 3 screws, you can remove the silver ring and then the black top plate, and then just there's a bottom plate in here as well that is attached to this little bar. So you remove all that and get the blades on their own, and you'll probably have to reassemble the diaphragm once taking this apart. But it's much larger than, it's still small, but it's much larger than on the MC Rokkor. So it is something you could actually conceivably take apart and put back together on your own. Whereas the MC Rokkor, I wouldn't recommend doing it, the 28mm. So that has the disassembly of the lens it's as far taken apart as I could find. Have things like the optics, and these can actually be taken apart further to clean on the inside. On some of them, especially on the front optical piece, you can see that there's let me zoom back in, a top ring here that it can actually be removed that has the kind of protruding glass element that, so you could clean inside of this, whereas a lot of the MD Rokkors don't offer that. So we got the optics and those separate from the body sections, like the focusing ring here and the other one, which does have the inner part of the outer part of the focusing mechanism, which I wasn't able to find out how to remove that from this body section with the depth of field scale. And things like the mechanical components on the stop-down lever and the diaphragm combined focusing mechanism piece on their own as well. Reassembly of this lens is not too difficult. I'll start with the ring here with the outer part of the focusing mechanism and the depth of field scale. And I need the inner part of the focusing mechanism right here. And before I had marked kind of where everything was lining up. So on this one I have 2 marks. Everything was marked according to this little divot in the inner section right here. So I'm going to line that up there. And then on the focusing mechanism, I marked on the top where that divot was, so over here. And just get these 2 back together. On the wide angle lenses that have finer focusing control, this can often be a little bit more challenging than on the normal, and especially on the telephoto lenses, because the focusing coils here are so much finer. So it may take a little while to get these back together. Okay, now that those 2 are back together, I'll spin this around the intersection here. I need to lock the focusing mechanism back in place. So I had kind of kept this blue ring on the inside here in the same position before, and I guess I should have marked as well where this was falling on here a little better before I'd spun this around. But you want the blue ring here to be in the same orientation it was when you took it apart. And in this case, I just have to line up the 2 screw holes right here with the little track here for the this piece right here, the metal bar piece in the middle. So I'll reattach this piece. And now I should be able to focus in and out. You don't want to focus too far at this stage because the track doesn't have any stoppers at the end, so you can actually focus past the track, and then getting the little bar back into the track is kind of an extra pain. Next up, I'll reattach the aperture control ring right here, which has the aperture control curve on the top. And the aperture control curve is going to go into the kind of indentation down here so they can move freely back and forth. And the little ball bearing also has to get lined up. And the ball bearing is going to go, there's a little thing right over by the depth of field scale with a spring in it. So I'm going to get the ball bearing lined up right here with the spring. Alright, and now I'll just slide the aperture control ring on top of this. You want to have it kind of angled in so that the ball bearing goes in first during this stage. So I need to have the grooves over here kind of lined up with where the ball bearing is going to go. And I think, yeah, I lost the ball bearing, so I have to get that lined up again. Try that again. One thing on the aperture control curve that is kind of interesting is, so we've got the aperture control ring here, and then the aperture control curve right over here. You can actually adjust where the aperture control curve falls, which will be important for how the aperture opens and closes. The way you do that is this little metal piece on this side. So it's kind of, you can see it's providing the stopping, so it's determining how far you can turn the aperture control ring in each direction. With this little post that's sticking out here. So you can undo this, and these are two slots that the screws are going into, and you can actually adjust where this post falls to finally adjust how the aperture opens and closes. Next up, I have just the little washer that's part of the mounting plate. This brass colored washer is just going to sit on top of the aperture control ring like that. And I'll get the back optical piece in place at this stage as well. So it just is going to screw down into the lens body here. I can lock it down using a spanning wrench. And the mounting plate on the back section here. The mounting plate has two rolls. It's both coupling the aperture control ring and the stop down lever into the diaphragm. The diaphragm is controlled by this little lever over on this side to open and close it, which is held in place by this metal wire here, which is acting as a spring so that it opens by itself. It's a little bit different than the other MD lenses where there's no spring on the diaphragm mechanism itself. In the mounting plate back here, I have this metal shaped crescent piece, and it has the stop down lever on this side here, which directly controls it. It's getting hooked up to the mounting plate by this little pocket over here. And then the other part is the aperture control ring coupling. So there's this post, metal black post right here, and that's going to sit in front of the aperture control curve. And as the aperture control ring rotates around, this little post will move along that curve and open and close the aperture. So to get this lined up, you need to have this little post in front of the aperture control curve over here, and this other, the diaphragm mechanism, the diaphragm control, going into the pocket right here. So I'll get this lined up, and then spin this around until the 4 screw holes going around in here are all lined up. And I'll reattach these two pieces. And to complete the back reassembly, just reattach this other part of the mounting plate and the black ring that's keeping things out of the inside of the lens. This is just going to sit so that the stop down lever over here, let me open this up, the stop down lever is going through the opening in this plate, and then the 5 screw holes going around here are lined up properly as well. Alright, so that has the back reassembly complete. Going back to the front section here, first off I'm going to get the front optic back in place, so it just screws in place. And I'll just tighten it down by hand. I guess I could use the flexible wrench to tighten it down, but that's probably not necessary. Now I'm going to get the focusing mechanism back in the position, in its general position, and it can be focused back to infinity at this stage as well. So looking at the focusing mechanism, there are these 2 bars right here, and then on the main lens body there's a bar right here, and that's what's limiting how far you can focus in either direction. You want it so that the focusing, that this bar is going in between this section over here, so there's shorter distance in between here, so that when you slide this in place, the little indicator goes between infinity and the minimum focusing distance of 0.3 meters. I'm going to just tighten this down kind of midway between these two using the 3 little screws with washers that go into the 3 little areas right there. And to actually focus this lens back to infinity, you would mount it on your camera at this stage right here, and then actually rotate the focusing ring around until you find where it's properly optically focused at infinity. And if you can't rotate it any further, you can loosen up these 3 screws, spin it around, tighten the ring back down, and keep spinning it. So you find where it's optically focused at infinity, and the indicator here will be on some random number there. And then you loosen up these 3 rings and spin this exterior focusing ring around without actually focusing the lens optically, so that it indicates infinity as well. And then you tighten these 3 screws back down fully. Next, I have on the reassembly, I have the ring here, which filters and the name ring screw into. So it has 3 screws going around here that I have to get in place. And finally, to complete the reassembly of the front piece here, I have the plastic name ring, which is just going to screw in place down into the filter ring holder that I just installed. And I'll lock this down using a pointed tip spanning wrench into 2 divots on either side. So that has the reassembly of this lens complete. You can check and make sure that everything is working properly, that the aperture control ring controlling the aperture, stop down lever fully opens and closes the aperture, and there's the clicking sound, and that you can focus between the 2 extremes properly. Overall, this lens is actually a whole lot easier to take apart than the MC 28mm f2.8 that I've taken apart before. It does use some of the cheaper MD components, like the plastic and the things that are the parts that are integrated into each other, like the diaphragm and the inner part of the focusing mechanism being a single component. But the design is actually a whole lot simpler, and it does make repairs a little bit easier. So while you can't do the same extensive repairs on this lens, it is a lot easier to repair.